Welcome to the Prison Professors Podcast. We serve people who face challenges with prosecution, sentencing, and prison. My co-founders are Sean Hopwood and Justin Paperny. My name is Michael Santos. We create digital content and our team offers individual consulting services. We also assist agencies that want to improve outcomes. To learn how we can help you, text the word PrisonPro to 44222. Again, text PrisonPro to 44222 and get our free brochure. You can also visit us at prisonprofessors.com or contact Justin at 818-424-2220. Please subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Send confirmation that you reviewed our podcast and we'll send you a free digital book. Stay tuned for a 20 to 30-minute episode of Prison Professors. Good morning. Welcome to the Prison Professors program. I am Michael Santos, and today I have the privilege of introducing you to Vincent McCrudden. He is another individual who has experienced the criminal justice system, and he's here to share his story with us. Vincent, I want to welcome you to our program, and I'd love you to just introduce yourself to our audience. Tell us a little bit about your background, if you could.
Sure. Yeah. Good morning, Michael, and thank you and your partners, Sean and Justin, for all you do for all of us guys that have been inside. Really appreciative of it. Basically, I don't want to get too deeply, but basically, I was born and raised in New York, and I was basically an athlete, a soccer player. I played a little bit professional soccer after having a great college career. For a year, and after that I ended up being down on Wall Street, and so I started my career in Wall Street in 1985 as a runner on the New York commodity exchanges, and basically was on Wall Street for over 20-something years. I eventually left the floors of the commodity exchanges and moved upstairs to what's called interbank brokering, and over the course of my career I brokered products in. I was head of global foreign exchange derivatives for Garb and ICAP, and I worked for other firms in credit derivatives and equity derivatives.
Wait a second, for Vincent, because I just read a story about you this morning. Vincent McCrudden is profiled in Forbes magazine. There's going to be I believe it's a 5-segment story by Walter Pavlo, who's a friend of ours at Prison Professors. And in that story, it was my understanding, Vincent, that you're kind of really a self-made guy. You said that you started on Wall Street and just threw it out there like you started at McDonald's, but really it takes a lot more than that. I mean, did you have an academic pedigree that put you on a pathway to start at Wall Street, or were you just a hardworking, self-directed guy? Yeah,
I was just a hardworking guy. I actually did not have the pedigree because most of my clients were basically worked at some of the largest banks in the world that you can imagine. And most of those traders were very, very educated, either had masters or PhDs in statistics, engineering, mathematics, business, you name it. And so I had to have a high degree of product knowledge even to be able to correspond and broker some of the products that I did. So I was a terrible student as a young man and even in college. But once I got down to Wall Street, I just kind of fell in love with the business and I became a much better student and learned so much more actually, while I was doing it on the run.
How old were you when you started?
23 or 24, I believe.
And what was your academic credential at that time?
I never graduated college because I thought I was going to be drafted into the old NASL, which was the professional soccer league in the United States at that time. I didn't really have any vision of what I was going to do as a career. My dad was a janitor, and my mom was a housewife. I was one of 8. So I really didn't have any career-oriented goals at that time. I just wanted to play soccer. So it was really kind of short.
There's a reason I'm asking that question, and it's because a lot of our listeners, Vincent, are in prison, and they live with some struggles in their life. And I love to, whenever I hear an inspiring story like yours, an individual whose father, as you just said, was a custodian, who didn't have an academic pedigree, somehow found himself in a way to begin pursuing his passion. And if a guy is in prison right now, he may have a lot of challenges, and I love to provide that lesson, that real lifeblood lesson, that regardless of where you come from, you can start carving a path that'll take you to where you want to go. And we're hearing that from Vincent McCrudden right now, who's telling us his story about a journey on Wall Street that actually resulted in him coming into the prison system. And he's going to walk us through there as we learn a little bit more about his career. So you start there as a runner, Vincent, and then you continue Tell us about the evolution of your career and what eventually brings you into the crosshairs of federal prosecutors.
Well, the funny thing is that I always wanted to be an asset manager, a hedge fund manager. When I was down the floors of the commodity exchange, I executed orders for guys like Paul Tudor Jones, who was my hero, who became one of the best traders in the world, Julian Robinson, George Soros, all these banks. And so I just wanted to be an asset manager. I thought I could, learn those different product areas, and that was really my dream. So I worked very, very hard to do that. I had a very young family at the time, and unfortunately, down in Wall Street, you can kind of get pigeonholed. Unless you come from an Ivy League background or that type of pedigree, you're really not going to be able to be an asset manager, a hedge fund manager. But I just dug down deep, and I just kept on saying that I could fulfill that dream, and I could do that. And in 2008, I actually fulfilled my dream. I left Wall Street and started my first hedge fund with $700,000. And during 2008, my fund returned 99.6% net audited return. And I was ranked by Bloomberg and Tremont and hedgefund.net as the second best multi-strategy hedge fund in the world. And I thought that I had finally reached the top of the pinnacle of my career goals, and was so happy. The fund got to $15 million at the end of 2008. And in 2009, I followed up with a 37.67 net audited return. So during that period of time, the world was embroiled in the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. Lehman Brothers and Bear Stearns and others went belly up. And we had an unprecedented bailout by the taxpayers of this country to bail out the existing financial institutions. And meanwhile, I was doing, incredibly well. And
was it a short fund? Were you shorting the market?
No, it was a multi-strategy fund. So I traded financial futures, and I traded large S&P kind of capitalized companies like the Amazons and the Googles or JP Morgans and Morgan Stanleys, Goldmans of the world. I traded those stocks, and I traded large ETFs. And I have an expertise in derivatives and options. So that's how I was a short-term trading methodology. And that's how I made the rate of return for my investors.
That's awesome. And how long did that business last before the government took an interest in you?
Well, the government had, I don't want to get into it, Michael, because it's really a long story, but I want your listeners to know that in the 25 years that I operated in the financial industry, I either executed and or traded hundreds of billions of dollars of financial transactions for the largest institutions in the world. I just told the story personally, how I started my own fund and was successful, and I've never had a single customer complaint. What I had drawn attention from the government was actually back in 2004, 2005, I became an activist against unfairness in the U.S. regulatory system, and that activism raised my profile to people that eventually would try to jam me up, which eventually led to me. So to follow up, in 2009, in September, the SEC and CFTC, because of my activism previously, subpoenaed all of my records for me personally, for my administrators, my auditors, my lawyers, my accountants, you name it, to try to do kind of a hardcore press to put me out of business, which they eventually did in 2009.
So it's a story of David versus Goliath. You're going after the government.
Yeah. Basically, absolutely. That's exactly what it is, David versus Goliath, Job, Joseph, whatever you want to call it. The interesting part is that I'm twice survivor of World Trade Center attacks. So I survived the World Trade Center attack in 1993. And I was in Building 1 on the 26th floor on 9/11. I lost 23 friends. So surviving those attacks, I thought as a citizen that I had maybe had an extra right to be able to speak out to certain things, and I couldn't be more wrong. And
Tell us what happened.
I started a blog. I started reaching out to elected officials. I started reaching out to media. And basically, as far as the U.S. financial regulatory system, and what happened is that there's a tremendous unfairness of how big and large firms get treated by regulators versus small firms. And it's basically anti-competitive. And they basically target small firms, put them out of business, while big firms, do egregious acts over long periods of time, know what's called control persons are ever named, shareholders pay for billions and billions of dollars of fines, but nobody goes to prison. And I think that's well written about. So that
sure, we saw that also in the real estate market, where you have millions or thousands of mortgage guys that are small potatoes going to prison, and people that were at the top of the food chain just paid a civil fine and moved on with their lives. The guys who orchestrated it was really illustrated well in that movie, The Big Short.
That's right, Michael. That's a great analogy, and that was a great movie to kind of point out the contrast of what goes on. When I was at Fort Dix, I did time with a guy who was sentenced to 25 years for mortgage fraud out of Cleveland, Ohio. And, bankers stole billions and billions of dollars, had to be bailed out, and yet this guy's doing 25 years for some little, BS type stuff. So, basically, after the regulators had targeted me, I decided to go to Singapore with my wife to get out of this country, to get away from these people. I figured that my track record over those 2 years was enough to basically get me hired by a larger hedge fund, maybe a global macro fund, which is what I always really wanted to do anyway. And I was just wrong. In December 2010, the CFTC charged me with a simple registration violation, saying my funds were not registered or exempted from registration properly.
Was that a civil action then?
That's a civil action. And, the fund was already closed for over a year or around a year. The investors got all their money back. They had done quite well. I was out of the country 10,000 miles away, and basically these guys still wouldn't leave me alone. And so I started a blog again, starting to be really more aggressive with my language and try to bring attention to what these guys were doing in the face of what was going on in the background. On December 19th, 2010, while I'm in Singapore, I got a call from my ex-wife. I left the home, my ex-wife, in 2006. My ex-wife called me and said that the FBI was there, that there was 40 armed FBI agents and local police outside her door, and they interrogated my 19-year-old daughter, who was home alone from college. So I flipped out. I was 10,000 miles away. I hadn't lived at that address in 4 years, and they knew it. I was in Singapore under my own name and my own passport, and these guys had done this deliberately. And so I flipped out. I wrote some things on my website and directly to certain government officials. And I came back to the United States on January 14th, 2011. And I was met directly off the airline by 25 armed federal agents. And I never saw the light of day again for 2 years. So that's how I came into being incarcerated in the criminal justice system.
Did I understand you correctly that you were arrested and then you were denied bail? You were locked in custody to fight your case?
I was denied bail as a threat to the community. Although
Primarily
I've never had
you were an outspoken activist. Is that what we're understanding?
The charges were Title 18, Section 875C, threatening government officials. Basically stuff that I wrote on that website. To this day, I will defend what I wrote. I believe it's still protected speech. But yes, the judge was the same judge who oversaw both the civil case and the criminal case. And the magistrate judge is the one who signed the search or arrest warrant on that December 19th. So my lawyer told me that there was very high-profile people involved, Michael. Loretta Lynch, who I had a previous history with, and I'd beaten her in federal court in 2003. They just were just continually going to be after me. So, I was denied bail. I was sent to a for-profit prison. I've never even heard of for-profit prisons before. I was sent to GEO facility, a detention center it's called, in Queens, New York. And then that's where really I spent 14 months.
So I'd like to point something out there for our listeners in prison, and I'm going to ask you about it, Vincent. Many of our listeners know that I was incarcerated for 26 years, and I was an active writer while I was in prison, and I always understood that my work could expose me to some retaliation. I was transferred more than 19 times. I served a considerable period of time in segregated housing. But for me, it was always understood that because I'm writing about the system and trying to help people understand the system, I felt that that was my duty as an American citizen, and my role as somebody who was serving a lengthy time that wanted to bring change and positive reforms and improve outcomes of the criminal justice system, that I really had to let the world know what's going on and what we could do better. But I understood the price that I was going to pay. I understood that for me, it would be fine if if they locked me in the shoe or if they transferred me from prison to prison to prison. I willingly paid that price because I felt it was important. It was an important mission, and I felt passionately about it. In your case, it's a little bit different. You're a successful guy who's trading hundreds of billions of dollars. You're trading at the highest levels of Wall Street, interacting, as you mentioned, with Paul Tudor Jones and some of the world's greatest investors. And yet you felt this, or at least I understand you to say, you felt this, you felt compelled to let the world know about injustices that you saw in there. Did you have any idea when you were doing it? I said I understood I could be transferred, I could go to the shoe and everything. I was already in prison, but you were in society. Did you have an idea that the ramifications could come, that you may be locked in prison for expressing your views and charged with threatening government officials?
No, the answer is basically no. I was naive, and as I mentioned before, I actually kind of thought the government would never do something like that to a guy who was a survivor of World Trade Center attacks. So I actually thought I would be kind of extra protected, and I couldn't really be more wrong, to be honest with you.
That's an important message for anybody listening to the podcast, is that if you are going to launch your voice, and if you are going to, and this analogy can be applied in many ways, whether you're going to trial, if you believe you're innocent, you're going to trial, you can expect that if you get convicted, you're going to face a much longer sentence. If you criticize the government, there's a possibility that officials in power may retaliate in such a way that causes you or your family to suffer and struggle, as we're hearing from Vincent today. So I just wanted to point that out because that's kind of what I was hearing from you. You said that you were charged. When you were convicted, what was the actual sentence that you received?
Unfortunately, I didn't go to trial. I actually picked a jury. I wanted the world to know not only what happened to me in this regard, but also what had been happening to me over the previous 13 years, how I was being targeted and pursued simply for sport, that I had not done anything wrong to society. I wasn't a predator. I wasn't a chomo. I wasn't a drug dealer, drug user. I wasn't in a gang. I didn't rip off anybody. I was never alleged to steal a cent. I mean, in any way, shape, or form, I never had a customer complaint in all the years I was in Wall Street. I wanted the world to know what these people could do to somebody, and I wanted that out there. And I was very naive in the criminal justice system, the U.S. regulatory system, and the media. I mean, the media was shockingly like stenographers. They just basically wrote what the government gave them. So I was over years and years, I was so disillusioned. I was told incorrectly I faced 30 years in prison that week. But I had already picked a jury. And my family and I and my children, I couldn't talk because I couldn't really do research because I was in prison. I really couldn't do my own research. I couldn't do anything from where I was. I was relying on people on the outside. And so I was unlawful, I was falsely told I faced 30 years in prison. And so I pled guilty to 2 years. So I was sentenced on April 6, 2012 to 28 months in prison. The government asked for 1 year supervised release, and I was given 2 years of supervised release, which would actually come in later when I got out and actually became a much more vocal activist. I started a new blog. I wrote a book, a Leverage and Extortion, one-man story of how the U.S. government operates. I wrote media. I wrote elected officials, and they came after me again.
Well, you've just given some more great advice about the challenges of going to trial. A lot of people don't recognize the dangers of going to trial. Vincent just told us that he was threatened with up to 30 years in prison. Recently, just a couple of days ago, Jeffree Stein, on January the 12th, Jeffree Stein, a journalist from the Washington Post, wrote a great opinion article called How to Make an Innocent Client Plead Guilty. And I will link to it in the show notes of this program, where many people, the author is writing about people who face these types of charges where they have to make a choice of pleading guilty to something they don't feel that they did, but willing to say, I'm just not willing to take the risk of spending 30 years in prison. And as we heard Vincent say earlier, there are many people in prison serving multiple decades for crimes that do not have any type of violence in them. There's a mortgage fraud guy doing 25 years he just described. Our nations are filled with people that are serving sentences that are our nation prisons are filled with people that are serving sentences that are far too long. Those aren't my words. Those are from the U.S. Supreme Court Justice Kennedy. And it's important to bring awareness to this. That's kind of one of our efforts at Prison Professors is to try and bring these reforms by profiling stories like Vincent and let listeners just decide, is there something that we could do better? And one of the things that we can do better is remove these threatening, this huge hammer or this sword that hangs over people's head that pushes them to plead guilty when they really should be, maybe letting a jury decide their verdict. Unfortunately, in your case, you did have to serve the time. And how much time did you serve when you were in prison, Vincent, altogether?
So, in reference to that article, maybe I picked that up on your Twitter feed. I did read that, and as you state, I mean, it's basically in the metrics that many people have referenced and referred to, that 91% of people plead guilty, innocent or guilty, and over 98% people are convicted in the federal system. It's like shooting ducks in a barrel. So that's been really my advocacy and my journey and my cause, is that is absolutely ridiculous. There's nothing in society that's successful. Baseball, you could bat 300 and be paid millions of dollars a year. And that has to do with the whole process, the system, the cottage industries, the judges, everything that surrounds it. And it's got to be addressed. I mean, it's got to be addressed. There's a lot of people aware of it. There's people like you who have been punished for it. There's your listeners that are sitting there now, and there has to be real reform. It can't be just little bit. It has to be an overhaul. And
there was an interesting interview on that subject that I did a couple of days ago with another client who was telling me his conversations with his lawyer, and his lawyer was a former assistant United States attorney. And the U.S. attorney said that the lawyer said that when he was with the assistant U.S. attorney's office, he, tried hundreds and hundreds of cases, and he had 99%, or he never lost a trial. And he thought of himself as a really brilliant prosecutor with an extraordinary success record. And then he crossed over to the defense bar, and apparently he never won a trial. And he realized then just how lopsided the system is, that you can, it's virtually a guaranteed victory for prosecutors, and for defense attorneys, it's an enormous battle. So we have to learn from stories like Vincent, who choose when they're in the crosshairs of the government to make a decision that's in the best interest of their family. Unfortunately, sometimes that means going to prison, even when you don't feel that you belong in prison, and that you feel that if a jury of your peers really had an opportunity to hear the entire case, they may come to a different conclusion. But the risk-reward situation is just so much in favor of the government that sometimes we have to make a decision that results in a guilty plea and a period of time in prison. Well, when you went into the prison system, Vincent, tell us a little bit about what mindset you had. What did you expect to accomplish or do while you were in prison?
My dreams were crushed, Michael. I was successful, and I thought that God had spared me. I don't want to talk too much about, faith or religion or anything like that, but I thought that God had a purpose or a plan for me, and to be thrown in prison and be ostracized by society to lose millions of dollars in defending myself over all that time. I was, I was fairly beaten man. I didn't really know what the future held. I served 2.5 years. I came out in 2013. When I came out, I met so many guys on the inside who were there for such petty stuff. A lot of guys were entrapped, set up. Guys were, trying, and they come out and they can't get jobs, and then they go back to doing what they do. So my eyes were exposed to so much that I wouldn't have known before. And I when I came out, I thought it was my fate. It was God's will that I just keep fighting, and that he would somehow find a way for me to raise awareness and bring attention. Maybe that was my purpose. And so I did. And on November 11th, 2014, Loretta Lynch, who had been my nemesis, was basically nominated by President Obama to be the U.S. Attorney General. I had a pending lawsuit against her. I had actually sued everybody in federal court. I did, federal tort claims. I was trying to bring attention in their own backyard, whether win or lose. I just wanted them to basically, answer to it. And so on November 14th, so I sent 200 emails to media and 200 emails to elected officials on that Friday, November 11th. At 6 a.m. on November 14th, that Monday, 25 armed FBI agents broke down the door of my apartment with my wife, and my deaf sister was in the guest room, and they arrested me. And they charged me with that over the preceding 2 years, that 9 pleadings to the court were deemed true threats, again, to the same charge basically as I had just done 2 years for. And so I was denied bail again, and I sat inside MDC Brooklyn for 4 months. On March 15th, 2015, the judge decided that all those 9 pleadings were protected speech, that I had not violated the law. But what the government did dirty, and I was past my term of supervised release at this point. I was basically a free man. I had served the prison time of the underlying sentence. I had served out the 2 years of supervised release. But what the government did was held in an abeyance, a charge. When they arrested me on November 11th, they took all of my computers and phones and everything. On my computer, they found a folder called Inmate Correspondence. In that folder, they found that I was helping a young man who was serving time in Berlin, New Hampshire, with a new law, Amendment 782, and he could benefit from it. I wrote his sentencing court, and I got 2.5 years reduced from his sentence. The judge, the judge found me guilty of association with a known felon, even though he was in Berlin, New Hampshire. I never spoke to him in person. I only wrote to him once and called him once. And ultimately, the judge found me guilty of that and sentenced me to 10 more months in prison.
So the important message here, if you're listening to this podcast, is remember that there is always more than one way to skin a cat. If the government isn't going to get you one way, there's another way that they can come after you. And it's just really important to understand the battles that you are going to fight. Winning a war sometimes requires us to lose some battles, or at least to understand the ramifications that come with the decisions that we make. And when we're embattled with the criminal justice system, we are on extremely weak ground. So I take a lesson away from that of what Vincent is sharing with us to say, really understand the price that you may pay if you choose to do this David versus Goliath battle. If you're willing to pay the price, I willingly paid the price by doing much time in segregated housing unit in high security prisons. Vincent paid the price by being separated from his family and going into the prison system. Us understand the costs. When you look back at this, Vincent, would there be anything that you would do differently? Did you see that this has been a victory for you, or do you see that the price that you have had to pay to try and express your First Amendment rights has been a little bit too high for your family, or has it been worth the price? What thoughts do you have on that?
It's thank you for that question. It's a difficult question because I'm speaking to different audiences here. To my brothers that I left behind in the joint, I want to be able to give them hope. I don't want to tell my story of fighting for all of us and say today that, no, I paid too high a price. My family and my children my wife paid too high a price. In some regards, I've lost, I haven't been able to make a living in 8 years. I'm broke now. I can't be employed, even though I have a pretty good CV. And so to my brothers in the joint, I just asked them to please, use me as an example and just keep fighting and fighting for your life and for your family and whatever. Maybe you could be different for you. But
yeah, I don't know about that, Vincent. I think that you're giving a very salient point right there, and it's one that I want to impress upon our listeners, is that you've just described the enormous pain that you and your family are going through, and the victory. What has been the victory? Have we changed? Has the government changed its ways? That's one of the reasons that I feel so strongly about spreading the message and letting people see all sides. If you are going to fight the government, you have to understand that it's not only you that could potentially suffer. That's why people plead guilty. They don't want their families to suffer. Vincent's chosen to spread his word, and he's paid a price. So it's almost as if he's been a martyr to a system, but was there going to be change? And I really empathize with you in not being able to overcome these struggles. But I think that's real value that you just provided. When you talk about, I couldn't get a job despite having a great CV, I can't get away from the government, I got trapped back in once again after finishing it the first time. Those are real lessons, and unfortunately they're still hanging over your head. I really empathize with you, Vincent, and I hope that you're going to be able to overcome these challenges.
Who knows, Michael, maybe I wasn't the messenger. Maybe it'll be somebody else. Maybe it's you or Sean or Justin or Walt or, other people out there. It wasn't for me. As I sit here today, I'm a defeated man. They beat me.
Well, they didn't beat you. You've come out with a book, Leverage and Extortion, one man's story of how the U.S. government operates. And anybody who is locked inside of a challenge with the criminal justice system could probably do very well by reading Leverage and Extortion, one man's story of how the U.S. government operates, and read about the incredible challenges that have befallen Vincent McCrudden and his family. You could also look at that on a series of articles that Forbes is publishing by Walter Pavlo, and just read about these challenges, because it is something that anybody should consider if they are facing problems with the criminal justice system. So I really urge you to learn more about Vincent McCrudden's story. We've come to the end of this podcast. Vincent, I'm going to ask you, do you have any final words that you might want to share with listeners of the Prison Professors podcast about what you have learned as you look back 10, 15, over the past 10 years or so that you've been in this challenge? What have you learned about this, and what might you do differently?
What I've learned is that the systems, the U.S. financial regulatory industry and the U.S. criminal justice system, the $1 trillion a year industry that it is all that I read and researched and thought it was. The metrics are truly cruel and unusual. Americans think we're the land of the free and home of the brave, and this is an issue that there's too many good people making money off of basically human trafficking. There's too many people's lives have been ruined who are in the joint serving incredible amounts of time like you are, that are forgotten. And so what I knew in 2004, what I know now is the same. It's just the same. I did my best to bring attention to it and try to evoke change. So I can't say that anything that I've learned along the way was anything different than I kind of thought when I first got involved with these people. And it's just a shame. And we have an administration now that seems to be more punitive. But there's so many people involved. The society is very punitive about us, about felons. We carry that with us for our life. No matter if we do 2 years or, like you, 20-something years, it's a life sentence, in background checks and denials of licenses. When I moved to Jacksonville with my wife, I couldn't live anywhere. I couldn't rent anywhere because of background checks. So we had to borrow money and actually buy a small place so I could actually live in peace. So I want to be able to give hope to my brothers in the joint. I enjoyed the people that I served time with. I enjoyed their stories, and I fought, for them as much as I fought for me. And I pray for them, and I love them. And I want them to have hope that there are good people out there that are still fighting for you. We haven't forgotten you, and we're trying. All of us are trying in some way, shape, or form. And that's really it, Michael. Thank you so much, for your time and let me share in my story. And God bless you and Sean and Justin in your journey of trying to educate people and bring attention.
Well, I hope that you will stick with the program and continue sharing your story on our various social media platforms, because this is one of the ways that we strive to spread awareness. You're absolutely correct that this is a huge, great social injustice, and the more attention we can bring to it, the more we can make people understand what can we do better. And I think that we do that by changing votes and letting our elected officials know that there are more than 2 million people who are currently in our criminal justice system. More than 10 million people right now in the United States are struggling with the criminal justice system in some way. It costs more than $90 billion a year. And the time is right now to begin bringing some awareness to it. So I want to thank Vincent McCrudden, the author of Leverage and Extortion, One Man's Story of How the U.S. Government Operates, for sharing his time with us. And we'll be back tomorrow with another inspiring guest that brings us some more education and insight into this system. If you'd like to know more about how we work, just text the word Prison Pro to 44222. That's text Prison Pro to 44222. And if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to us on iTunes, rate and review the show. Thank you.